Today, we are going to discuss critical thinking in academic writing. It is important to note all the words that we have used. Academic writing, we understand, is a different kind of writing to anything else that we had learnt about before. It is not creative writing, it is not journalistic writing, it is writing that has to do with scholarship and some more things. And within this, we find we have to bring in this concept of critical thinking. Critical thinking or reading vis-a-vis simple reading. When we read anything, what do? We take the written word in a very simple way. The word stands for its meaning. Through simple reading, what do? We avail information, but we do it without analysis, without evaluation, at face value, not question the assumptions that are behind the writing, and accept wholeheartedly the basic premise of the text. What do we mean by this? We do not question what the author is writing. We accept everything that is written on the page. Now I am going to read out the first line of a very famous novel by Jane Austen called Pride and Prejudice. This was published in 1813. And the first sentence reads, "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." I would request you to reflect on this sentence and understand what you get out of it. Now, if you are doing a simple descriptive reading, you understand this meaning that all single, rich, young men of this particular society are looking for a wife. But upon analyzing the socio-cultural context of the time, it becomes clear that the author is using irony over here to comment on the contemporary society and the position of women then, and points out that the compulsion is more on the girl's side to look at prospective young men as husbands. So that's a more critical reading. So we have already shifted from the simple reading which told us that all rich young men were looking for wives to the idea that it was not the men who were looking for wives, but it was more from the perspective of the women that they were looking at rich young men as prospective husbands. So what is the necessity of critical thinking in academic writing? Why should we go through this process? Isn't it enough to just read what is given on the page? So why do we at all need to think or read critically is a very important question. Now, most students feel that writing is expressing in the written language all that they have read or know. But that's a superficial way of looking at writing. If you read a prose piece and write a simple summary, that's not academic writing. In this module, we will understand the difference between simple reading and thinking to critical thinking and reading, and how that leads to proper critical writing, that is the desired outcome of academic writing. Often students do not get the marks they feel they deserve, and are told by the examiner that the writing was plebeian and that the writing was not critical. So, thinking critically. What do we mean when we say that a sample of writing is descriptive and not critical? And how do we transform this descriptive writing into critical writing? By thinking critically. You have the first thing is a descriptive text, the text that tells you some things, information that they give you. That information is not enough. It needs to undergo analysis. Analysis means, as we have already discussed, you try to look into the meaning that emerges when you question certain things. Now, after analysis, you will have inferences. That means you will analyze words used, theories expounded, and then you will come to certain inferences from that to this. And this has to be then evaluated against existing knowledge. So, in the following slides, we will look at concepts of critical thinking. Critical writing is connected to critical thinking and critical reading. Critical thinking or critical reading, as we have been talking about, is a disciplined process. Critical thinking or reading involves a systematic process of making meaning of a given text. This meaning emerges out of a complex relationship between the text, the reader, the available knowledge around the subject accessible to the reader. As we proceed, we will understand in more detail how this happens. Critical thinking or reading, a disciplined process of scholarship we have spoken about. What is the first step? Step 1. Any thinking or reading would involve descriptive thinking, reading, and breakdown of the text through various prisms. We discuss what is being written, meaning, who is writing, and we collect or gather information. Then we read with the author's assumptions, note the arguments that are being presented, and at the same time note the evidence. But we do this in a very simplified manner. Step 2 involves something more. This would involve subjecting the information into or through the crucible of analysis. The first thing we do is to apply reason. What we are reading, does it make sense? Is it, making sense to us? And what do? We look at the argument. Is the argument valid? So you see, one is moving away from very simply accepting what is there, either in the idea or in the written text. We are moving away to questioning the assumptions given over there. So we do not accept assumptions without corroborations. So analysis would be, when you have assumptions, you will also look for corroborations. Check whether the material or the scholarly evidence is acceptable. The author may have given a lot of arguments. The author may have also provided certain evidence and certain data to support his argument. When you're analyzing, you have to start questioning. You have to look at it, whether it is valid, whether it is acceptable or not. Now, the data that is provided to support the argument, is the data relevant? Has the author or the person, who's given the idea, is the idea, the evidence that is being provided, is it relevant? Then you look at the structure. And what you do most importantly is process the whole information through logic. So without reason, without logic, without checking the assumptions that are given behind the idea that is being projected or the book that is being written, you cannot have critical thinking. The third step is evaluation. What does that mean? This would imply connecting the premise with existing scholarship. That means you judge and you either qualify whether what has been presented is matching with existing scholarship. Then you ask yourself, what is the value of this study? Or an idea that has been projected, what is the value of the idea? Is it valid argument? And when you have the value, is it useful for future scholarship in that domain? If it is not useful, then is it worthwhile proceeding with it? This is critical thinking as a process, a diagram. And this diagram, look at the center. At the center is the idea, the topic or the issue. The issue can be an idea somebody has. The topic can be something that a person is discussing or is thinking about or is writing on. So, when you have a topic or issue at the center of the thought process, on one side you have, we have been talking about the 3 steps. So, the descriptive step, answers questions like what is this all about? Then when did this happen? And then who is talking about it, who is presenting this, and then you have where did this happen? All these are very laden with information, but little else. What is happening? When did it happen? Who is involved in this, and where is it happening? So when we started, we said this was descriptive reading or descriptive thinking. This is what the answer that you're getting. Then the second step was analysis. So when you move on to the second step, what are the questions that you're asking? You're asking why and how. That means, why did this happen? You're looking for causality. You're looking for this happened. You can say A happened and B happened. That would be part of description. But when you say A happened and hence as a result B happened, you're doing an analysis of it. And how did it happen? So this is where you have your analysis. And the third step, you talk about evaluation. What if what we are talking about is not really correct? What if it had another trajectory? So you were evaluating the validity of the argument or the thought process. And then you're looking at future. What next? Yes, this is the analysis we have, but where do we go from here? And so what? How does it impact the knowledge domain? How does it impact scholarship? So this is part of evaluation. So the process of critical thinking and reading, the most important aspect you have is ask questions. I'm sure, when you all were very young students, you had, to format the WH, questions or, questions that began with WH. You had to make questions with them. In a similar fashion, I tell you that when you are doing critical thinking, you have to ask questions. So the first question, as we saw in the diagram, and here we are discussing, is descriptive. What happened? Where did it happen? When did it happen? So answers to these questions would describe or provide information. Mind you, right from the beginning, we've been talking about collecting information, and the second step is always analyzing that information. So the second step is analysis. Why? How? What if? Answers to these questions will help analyze the text. So what will be evaluation? Evaluation will be when you check whether this helps existing scholarship, domain knowledge, which takes it forward to a future position. The process of critical thinking and reading, which is what we have discussed the first and the second steps. Now we are talking about evaluating a text. So you read. First you have read actively. As you read, you keep questioning the arguments the author presents, the evidence to support it, and the person, who's reading, his or her assumptions as well as the author's assumptions. And then what you do first is active reading and then reflect on the information. You have got the information, you're looking at the assumptions and the biases, and this may influence your interpretation of the information. Then what you do is engage in discussion. That means before evaluation is complete, you must get some feedback. You cannot judge it yourself, because if you judge it, it would be one-dimensional, only your ideas. So engage in discussions and feedback. Discuss your idea or reading with peers and mentors. And lastly, what you do, you explore alternative viewpoints and counter arguments. That means nothing has a simple answer. If there is an argument, there can be many counter arguments. And when you are doing critical thinking and reading, you have to take all aspects into consideration. So this time we will have a quiz, the first quiz that I'm talking about now. What is descriptive reading? How many steps are there in critical reading? And then I come to mention two of those question words, those WH words for descriptive reading. These are answers that you have to give. The first answer, descriptive reading is reading without analysis, collecting information but not questioning it. The three steps that the second question demands is descriptive, analysis, evaluation. And the third question that I said, what are the WH words that you would use to ask questions? It could be who, where. The quiz asked for two, so who and where would be enough. But you can say who, where, what, and you can use any two of them. Qualities that you require for critical thinking. From our discussion, it is very clear that there is never one answer to anything. So, qualities that you require for critical thinking, the first one is open mind. The second one is to be without bias. And the third feature would be a questioning temperament. What is an open mind? An open mind is a mind that is open to all points of view. So you can see the idea and counter ideas. No bias implies that you may not bring any of your own assumptions into the analysis and reject the idea purely on the basis of personal opinion. And when we spoke about the most important thing was a questioning temperament. A questioning temperament means that one should not accept anything without supporting evidence. So if the author says A is equal to B, you will not accept it without looking at corroborative evidence. Questioning temperament also implies that you can question your own beliefs when faced with evidence to the contrary. That means you believed in something, you had an idea of something, or you had knowledge of something. But when you find that there is something that is presented to you that does not match with your own ideas, you must be open-minded enough to accept this. Again, just to test, we'll have a quiz. And let us see how much of attention you have given to what we have discussed so far. With reference to qualities necessary for critical thinking, which of these statements are true? And I have 4 statements over here. You have to tell me which are true and which are false. The first statement is, accept only your knowledge. The second statement says, open mind. The third statement says, accept the text without reason. And the fourth statement says, question everything. Please reflect on these and find out what is true and what is false. The first answer is false. The second answer is true. The third answer is false. And the fourth answer is true. Now, this transition from critical thinking to critical writing. Critical thinking and critical reading will lead to critical writing, which is the most important tool or skill which is a necessity for academic writing. So, how do we move from critical thinking to critical writing? Because our objective is finally to be proficient in academic writing. And all this that we are coming to know from these modules is going to lead to that one goal we have, how to write well in an academic writing module. So what are the features of critical writing? They are, how will you write? Clear, clarity. That means What you write must be very clear. Cogent. Cogent meaning, it must be properly, logically formulated. Concise. Brief. Brevity is the mother of wit, so brief. But brevity does not mean it will be so brief that you do not put all your points together. So comprehensive. So concise yet comprehensive. And lastly, conclusive. So what are the steps of critical writing? As I said, you begin with an idea, a clear idea. And then we move on to step-by-step description. We present arguments based on logic. We analyze the different aspects. We check the data support. And we also see the relevance of the evidence and also the validity of the evidence. We also bring in other perspectives. And lastly, because it is critical writing and the emphasis is going to shift from thinking to writing, it is important to note that we must develop or express in a balanced style in appropriate language. What does appropriate language signify? There must be an element of formality. It must be logically structured, and choice of lexis or words. This is very important. You must choose words with care. Do not use words that do not pinpoint the meaning. So your choice of words must be very, very clear. One example that I can give you is when one point is without any doubt, it's incontrovertible, then one can use definitive words like demonstrates or confirms. So I can say, hence this argument confirms. When I write confirms, it means that I am confident of the conclusion. But if the point is tentative, that means I'm still working around it. If it is tentative, then one should use words like suggests, or may lead to, or may be read as, etc. So these are words that are tentative and not totally confirmed. Another quiz for you. Are the following statements true or false? Critical writing must be abstract. Argument may be based on feelings. Reasoning is necessary in discussing the idea. So what are the three statements that I have made? The three statements are: critical writing must be abstract. Argument may be based on feelings. Reason is necessary in discussing the idea. So the first statement is obviously false because it needs to have evidence and data support. You cannot write anything in the abstract. You cannot come up with a theory in the abstract. If it is in the abstract, you have to gather enough evidence and data support to prove its validity. The second one is false also. You do require logic to take the argument forward. Because it is a very, very academic discipline, it is not creative writing, it is not imaginative writing. So you need logic to take it forward. And the third one, of course, reason is important for the development of the idea. We have been talking of reason and logic and structure right from the beginning. So now we have come to the end of our discussion, and we find that critical thinking is extremely important in our discussion of academic writing. And why is it so? Critical thinking involves reading descriptively. So critical thinking does have reading, but it is not simple reading. It is reading descriptively followed by analysis or analyzing the argument. So if we read simply and descriptively, we would not have critical thinking operate. To have critical thinking properly operate, we must move from description to analyzing argument, and then we must move further on to drawing inferences through the use of logic. When you draw inferences, you must know this happened, so that happened, and why. So we are looking at inferences based on causality. Then we move on to evaluating validity of argument and evidence. So we are talking about validity of argument and evidence. After this, it leads to writing clearly, cogently, cohesively, comprehensively, and drawing a new logical conclusion. This is most important. And then we find that this is the importance of critical thinking in this whole domain of academic writing. Otherwise, the question may arise, why are we spending so much of importance or time on thinking about critical thinking? All thinking is not critical thinking. All reading is not critical reading. All writing is not critical writing. And all these together lead to academic writing that does not happen unless you go through these steps and processes initially. The final outcome is academic writing in proper language, in appropriate language. So, what do you get after critical thought is over? You have an expression in academic writing. You develop a module or an expression or a text with appropriate language that is acceptable as a new addition to existing scholarship on that domain of knowledge. That is why it is so very important to know about critical thinking and critical reading in order to be proficient in academic writing, because academic writing is not possible without these initial steps that we had taken earlier. The first few steps of critical reading, critical thinking, and critical writing together will equip us with all the tools necessary to write proper critical and academic writing. Thank you.